Hello, and welcome to the 61st Annual Seminar on Glass of the Corning Museum of Glass. My name is Mika Fay, and I'm the museum's manager of education and interpretation. This year's seminar is focused on our special exhibition, Dig Deeper, Discovering an Ancient Glass Workshop, which closed in January. The theme of this session is bringing the ancient world to life for museum visitors. You can place any questions for our speakers in the Q&A feature, and you may use the chat feature to interact with other participants. Our technical support team is available to you as well. You may contact them at avuser@cmog.org or using the chat feature in the seminar lobby. The Corning Museum of Glass does not tolerate hate speech of any kind, and we ask that you please keep the comment section respectful and supportive. This afternoon, we are welcoming Sarah Farron, Troy Smythe, and Kate Larson, who will introduce themselves in the following video. Kate and Troy will be with us after the video to answer questions.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here for this virtual portion of the session titled Dialogic Thinking, Incorporating a Community's Perspective When the Subject Matter is Personal. My name is Troy Smythe. I am the Manager of Interpretation Strategy and Education Projects for the Corning Museum of Glass, located in Corning, New York, on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I want to introduce a couple of people that will be joining me today. The first is Catherine Larson, who I will refer to as Kate, if you're okay. And she is our curator of ancient glass here at the museum. And also Sarah Farron, who is the principal at Dialogic Consulting. And both of them will be sharing more later. So we felt like the exhibition Dig Deeper that the seminar is really kind of gathered around provided a case study for how the Corning Museum of Glass took into account contemporary issues related to objects from the past that would go on view that also had connections to our local community. And some questions kind of arose for us, which is why would the museum decide to take on this work in the first place? But also, how did we conduct research for figuring out how to incorporate voices beyond the museums as we kind of shaped the interpretation of it? And we're sort of kind of unfolding this story kind of the way it happened for us as we were working on the exhibition. And we thought we might start by just having Kate give an overview of the exhibition from her point of view. So I'll turn it over to Kate.
Troy, should we say why we're doing this pre-recorded and not live?
Oh, yes, actually, that's a great thing to be able to share. So the reason we're not doing this live is because Sarah Farron is occupied on the time of our presentation during seminar, leading, and I wrote this down, being part of a program called the Museums Respond, Strategies for Countering Anti-Semitism and Hate. It's a program in DC sponsored by the Institute for Museum and Library Services, the Council of American Jewish Museums, and the White House. So we got trumped by federal work, and I feel like that's okay. So thank you, Sarah, for doing that important work too. After the virtual presentation, we will also have a facilitated discussion about the things that we discussed with our in-person and live audience as well. So yeah, thanks, Kate.
Sure. Okay, so with that, I'll just, as you prompted, go into a little bit of background. So as most participants in seminar likely know by now, if this is your first kind of time tuning in, here's a little recap. The exhibition Dig Deeper was focused on the archaeological site of Jalomeh, which is located in what is now modern Israel, kind of in the north of the country, quite close to the city of Haifa. And in the years leading up to the development of the exhibition, I was really focused on the ancient history of the site as a glass workshop in antiquity, as well as the perspectives of the American archaeologists who worked there. So representatives from Corning, from Missouri, from other American institutions who went and conducted the archaeological fieldwork. That was really the frame that I was bringing to the project. And as I started to talk about the exhibition more widely, and especially with people who didn't come from that background, who weren't archaeologists or weren't glass specialists, people started to ask me, like, oh, do you mean, is this site in the West Bank or is this site in Palestine? And at first I thought, well, you know, maybe that's because I found out there is the name of Jalame is a common Arab village name. There are Jalames all over this part of the world. And there is, in fact, one in the northern part of the West Bank, not too far from the Jalame of the glass workshop site, the archaeological site. So I thought, oh, people are like, maybe people are just confused. Like, there's just multiple places by the same name. And I wondered if part of the confusion might come from the name of the excavation publication, which specifically says that the site was located in late Roman Palestine, which is historically accurate, right? That was the name of the Roman province. And then I looked a little bit further and realized that in addition to that kind of Wikipedia disambiguation, the site also actually does take its name from a Palestinian village, which was depopulated when Israel was founded in 1948, which is extensively documented. The remains of that village are located not exactly where the archaeological excavations took place, but just adjacent. Actually, you can see fairly well in these maps. So the Jalame site, the village, the 19th, early 20th century village is located sort of just adjacent on these maps. You can see where Jalame is, and then where it says Kirbet al-Safna is where the excavations took place. So these are just sort of giving you a little bit of a sense of the geographic relationships among all these places. So this village does appear on these British survey maps and is also the location you can see on the, and I have to look at my other screen, sorry, I'm turning my eye line away, this police post at A, which brings us to our third sort of complexity as we were thinking about the place, the physical location of the archaeological project, which is that it is still the location of a jail, a detention center, which is especially notorious for detaining Palestinian political prisoners, including children, as was documented in a Guardian article about 10 or so years ago. So all of these things we were sort of coming up against, which didn't necessarily immediately affect our desire to tell the story about this ancient glass workshop. But a few years ago, the Corning Museum published an equity statement, which reads in part, the Corning Museum of Glass has historically focused on telling the story of glass unrelated to issues of equity and inclusion. And by failing to address and acknowledge these exclusions, we play a role in perpetuating them. So as Troy and I really started to think about the exhibition, think about the frame that we were bringing, but the frame that others might bring to this part of the world, to these names, to these histories, we really felt that by not addressing this, we were in fact playing a part in excluding these stories. And it really impacted the ways we would be able to talk about the history, the geography, and the heritage around this place in the world.
Thanks, Kate. So just a little brief introduction to interpretation as it works out here at the Corning Museum of Glass. So the way I describe my work, I describe Kate's work as she's a content specialist. It's her job to really understand the objects themselves, the context that surrounds them, and all the stories that are attached to them, and their research. I am a content strategist. So my job is to connect with the knowledge that Kate has and then figure out the best ways, or help us as a team figure out the best ways to connect that experience of those objects with as many people, with as many wide, diverse perspectives as we can. And as a result of that, we really want to be able to measure how successful we are at doing that. And so evaluation, visitor studies become a part of what I do or help facilitate here at the museum. And we felt like in this case, rather than doing a summative evaluation, which would be done at the end of the exhibition to kind of, figure out whether or not we hit our targets in terms of visitor outcomes, this exhibition would especially benefit from formative evaluation, where we're actually having our community really help us inform how we create and what we're creating to put in the exhibition. And because of the nature of the exhibition, and because our community, we have members of our community that have lived experiences tied to this area, both Kate and I agreed that we really didn't have the expertise to speak for those voices. And that was when we, reached out to Sarah and asked her if she could work with us, and she thankfully did. But I thought maybe, Sarah, this would be a good time. When does one call Sarah for work like this?
Thanks, Troy. And to follow on your lead of speaking of kind of Kate's role and your role, I think how my role fits is that, I'm never a content specialist when people call me in, though, especially in this case, I do have experience working across particular communities that are invested in this region and in this history. A little bit of being a content strategist, i.e. when I have to think about which content to use in helping folks talk through issues more effectively. But what I really specialize in is the idea of, if you, Troy, are someone who connects the content with audiences, my main focus is how do we connect audiences with each other, right? Specifically when we are looking at content that we know has historical legacies that are challenging, that for some are trauma-inducing. My background, with this space, but particularly is that I've worked as a curator with the Arab American National Museum, and then as a director of education with the Tenement Museum, which, though not an exclusively Jewish space, does tell many Jewish American stories. This topic and this exhibition, were particularly relevant to me when the team first reached out. So I'm excited to have been a part of it. And I think, in this case, it was about my personal interests, but it's generally around teams who are saying, yeah, we have an equity statement now, or, oh, we know that this might be challenging, and we are willing to actively involve our communities in giving voice and in sharing voice in these spaces. And that's not an easy thing to do. And sometimes it comes with tension, and sometimes it comes with disagreement. And the role of a facilitator is to help navigate that so that we can come up with the best exhibition or program or, other aspect of what the museum is working on.
Thank you, Sarah. So how does this process play out in a place like the museum here? Well, our exhibition, as Kate described, was was pretty far down the road in terms of content when we started to really kind of ask ourselves some of these more reflective questions. We knew that there were certain givens that we needed to take into consideration. There would be maps. We would be responsible for the presentation of objects ownership, and ownership, as we know within the museum world today, lots of people can sense a feeling of ownership, not just the people who steward an object, but people who have personal connections to it. And so we wanted to hold ourselves accountable to that. And then obviously, with this subject matter, there are differing perspectives on historic events that we needed to also take into account. I have some kind of personal values that I attach to this work, but Sarah, are there, things that you kind of look for, the work to result in?
Sure. So when we're thinking about community engagement, I do want to make sure that we don't gloss over something, Troy, that you said, which was, in this case, much of the content had already been selected, which to be fair, is oftentimes when museums think about, oh no, now that we need to bring in some folks. And I want to point out that in the most ideal sense, for all of those folks who are listening and are involved in the gathering, we would ideally want to be working with community in the selection of content in and of itself, right? So, and even before that process, we want to be working with community so that the community is involved in that very initial stage of what is it we are actually trying to do together, and what the overall impact or goals that we're looking for and looking to build out as a team at Corning or anywhere else, right? So this was very typical of a lot of the work in terms of where museums are in this process, but it is by no means ideal in that way. Now, I say that with great humility and gratefulness for Corning for saying, even at the stage that they did, hey, we know some of the content already, but we are still open and malleable and flexible about what our community wants to do with that content. And that's a flexibility that not every museum enters community spaces with either. When I'm
And I'll
thinking,
just add, sorry,
yeah,
Sarah,
no,
I just want to
please
add,
do.
like, I think you were really helpful in helping us think about kind of what's still on the table. Like, where are the decisions that can still be made that we can really invite people in to talk, like, contribute to make real empowered decisions around and contributions to, versus things like the exhibition's already, we're moving forward. It's not on the table to cancel the exhibition at this point or change it substantively, right?
Yeah.
So finding where those spaces are that we could guarantee that our community would have impact, and just kind of being really honest with ourselves and with our community members about that.
Well, and Kate, that sets us up really nicely to look at, kind of what we, the four of us, talked about as these 4 R's, right, in terms of this process and how we work through things. I actually would want to start and just kind of mention relationships, right? It's the 3rd one down on your list at the moment, but that though we were later in the process in terms of moving these forward, we benefited greatly from the fact that the museum already had sustained relationships with some of the folks in the community that we were inviting to be a part of this process. And so I think that it made up in some ways for the timely nature of this. It also allowed me as a facilitator and the team to know who was coming into the room, right, in a way that we don't always get to do when working with community. And this was an extremely impressive groups of folks, right? That kind of takes us to this space of recognize, right? The idea that every one of the people who were there were intentionally chosen because of either their own personal backgrounds in terms of being a religious leader, being an artist, being an educator, a variety of folks who brought various perspectives to the space, which was really, really helpful for us. And then Kate, to your point, thinking about this idea of results, what was actually achievable given what we were coming into the room with? What were the non-negotiables? What wasn't going to be able to shift or change because of where we were in the process? But also really pushing the folks at Corning to say, oh, no, we don't want to change that, but well, we actually could at this point, right? And getting us to be a little more flexible in terms of our ownership and our schedule as we move forward. And it might actually be better for one of you to speak about reciprocity and maybe a little more in relationships as well.
Yeah, I can do that. So as Sarah mentioned, we, through the foresight of a predecessor of mine, Chris Wetterland, who's since retired, where you start in terms of kind of relationships, you can't build all relationships with communities at the same time. You need a strategy that is coincides with your resources. But we have quite a few objects in the collection that are connected to religious practicing religious groups now. And so Chris had the foresight and once she learned that an interfaith coalition existed in our area, made up of people of different faiths, including Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, she reached out to them and said, you know, we're a place that we want you to see us as a gathering space and a place to talk and to share ideas, and we'd love to be a part of that as it's appropriate. And so that existed about 4 or 5 years before the exhibition even started, but we hadn't done a ton of programming in that direction. So, but when we came to realize that we were going to need the perspective of our community here, I reached out to that group and invited them. We do believe, you know, the museum values, and I feel like that in terms of involving the community, reciprocity is an important aspect of that. The benefit of your time with your community circle, is what we call them here, can't just benefit the museum. It needs to benefit the community in some way. So we actually offered a small stipend to pay our community partners. Wasn't a lot. We didn't have a huge budget for it, but we wanted them to know that we did value their perspective. Some personal, kind of from my perspective as a interpretation manager, I feel like evaluation is really key to what we do. As Sarah mentioned, it would have been ideal if we had started at front end evaluation, kind of before we even had a checklist. And we're actually, as a museum, trying to move in that direction, but that takes a shift of energy and education. You know, we haven't done a lot of that, so we're still educating ourselves on that process. But even so, what's important to me is that whenever we do some sort of visitor involvement or visitor engagement in evaluation, that what I don't want it to do is to feel like work. I want it to feel the way we hope our experiences with our collection and with our programming at the museum feels for visitors, that it adds value to the quality of their life. And also important for a community focused museum as much as ours is that it actually play a role in building community. It's not standing outside of the community. It's a part of the community's process to build itself. So those are the things that our museum was kind of bringing to the table in terms of values. I don't know if that answers your question or kind of gets to what we needed to clarify, Sarah.
No, it does. It's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sort of leads us into sort of how this looked at the museum. So as I mentioned, we call these this, you know, and since we've done this, this was our real first attempt at kind of gathering a group for work like this. We had actually worked with community advisors and other capacities, but this was the first time that it really resulted in a long-term group coming together to work. We ended up meeting 3 times between March and April. As I mentioned, you know, it was made up of groups that people from an interfaith group, both with connections both to Israel and Palestine, facilitated dialogue with Sarah. That really was a benefit to Kate and myself, is that, you know, taking us out of that facilitation role allowed us to really be participants in the conversation, to share ideas and actually really hear what we were hearing our community advisors say. And it really helped us articulate what I felt like ended up being super important was the values. You know, this was such a local, you know, and one of the things that's really important to point out is this is not kind of a recommendation for every museum to do. This process was very geared towards Corning's and its nearby area, the dynamics that exist here and the relationships with this area that exist here. So it's really not a prescription for what might happen in other communities, but it is what happened here. And then articulating the values that are unique to our area. And then, you know, some of the things that came out of that were a really important map review in terms of like how things are named, font size, all of these very detailed things. And we'll go into that a little bit more. But and then also a community statement that seemed important to our group, and some formative evaluation of select labels. And I think probably why don't we shift to you, Kate, and you can talk a little bit more about that. Is there anything I'm missing here?
No, I'll just, oh, yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
So sorry, I do want to just emphasize one piece for folks who are thinking about doing more of this work moving forward. And this is something that's, you know, the idea of doing value-led work in museums is very prevalent right now. It's something that a lot of folks are talking about. It's surprising it's taken us this long for that to be a major movement in museums. But I want to point out that the values that you're looking at that were articulated here, oftentimes as museums or as facilitators, we come into spaces saying these are the values. What was really wonderful about this process was that this is a group of folks who knew both the museum and the community and had a window into how those spaces intersected. And what that meant was that this group also spoke in values. We thought that we might want them to develop values as a group, but I hadn't even facilitated that far into the process to broach that. And they already had begun using what I would call value-based words to describe what they wanted out of the process. So even in speaking about goals, with the group and what our intentions were as a team and what we wanted to hear from them in terms of what their goals and intentions were for being a part of the process, they were already saying, we want this to be a place of common ground. We want this to have balance. It's important to us that people hear the truth. It's important that this is not a space where any religion or ethnic identity is erased, right? I mean, they were speaking in value-led terminology, which will not happen in every group that you work with. But in this case, it was a very, it became the guiding framework for every decision that was made afterwards.
Yeah, and to be clear, the words that are in circles to the right of this on the slide, they are the language that Sarah recognized and pulled out as the values that were being talked about. And they came from the group. They did not necessarily come from Kate and I. We really knew what was important to us. We wanted to know what was important to them. I will say that it wasn't until Sarah pointed out that, they're already telling you what you want, what they want in terms of values, and started to pull those things out, which was really helpful to me. So.
Yeah, and I'll add that I think the values were especially helpful when you can't always, you want to honor and respect people's time. So you can't always go back to, your community group members for every decision that you need to make kind of along the way. And to just have this sort of framework of the values, and you could think to yourself, oh, what would I know how this person would respond to this particular proposition. Or let's hold ourselves accountable to these standards when we're making decisions that we might not be able to invite the group back for all the time. But having this kind of working framework really helped us. So yeah, I want to get through and kind of show you how this kind of ended up playing out in the exhibition itself. So here's the sort of entrance to the exhibition with the title wall. You can see the maps really prominently placed. We ended up having a map of the location of the site in antiquity when it was a glass workshop, as well as a map, and you actually saw the final version of this map a little bit earlier in this presentation, a map of today, what it looks like in 2023 and May 2023, before the events that have been taking place the last 6 months or so. And just a little inset as well, kind of showing the relationship of Corning to this part in the world, since a lot of our visitors might not have the same kind of mental map of this location that some of the rest of us might. We also had 3 languages on the title wall. We weren't able to do this all the way through the exhibition, but we did include English as well as both Hebrew and Arabic on the title wall, so that there was that representation of those languages and cultures in that space in that way. And then over to the right, you'll see the community panel that Troy referenced a bit earlier. And this we kind of wrote in concert with our community circle members, sort of to surface a lot of the conversations we had. And what was really another thing that they really had contributed to was we talked in the form of questions and dialogue and discussion rather than firm answers. And they wanted to bring this sort of spirit of inquiry into the space so that it could almost be a lens that we were encouraging people to approach some of this material with through these sort of guided questions and ways of thinking. So that was really prominent when people entered the space. We also really did a deep dive on a lot of labels. I'm just showing you one example here of what sort of the name of the site itself. And this was really our place to talk about some of that history that I mentioned earlier. And you'll see in the initial draft of the label that we don't mention, we sort of say there's a name of the village, but we don't say anything about the events of 1948 that led to the abandonment of that village. And that was something that the community really encouraged us to say. And we agreed. We thought that was an important thing to acknowledge when we think about the ancient and modern history of this area. So that was something that got sort of changed at this point. And we also included artwork by a contemporary Palestinian artist, Dima Srouji. And the artwork in particular, Dima talks about this as they're imitations of ancient glass objects, which appear in museums around the world, Western institutions like ours, and have been taken away from their homelands, from their original place where they came from, just like the Palestinian people as well, that both have been really removed and taken away from their ancestral locations. So we were able to use this artwork to both think about heritage in terms of material heritage and archaeology, as well as the people who occupy these territories over long histories as well.
Great, thanks, Kate. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Nope. I'm kicking it back to you.
Okay, all right. I didn't know if you had more.
Nope.
So that gives you an idea of sort of how the exhibition took shape. I'd like to spend the balance of our time, we have about 10 minutes, maybe a little more, just to talk about kind of looking back on that process. And obviously, you know, what happened after the Hamas attacks against Israel of October 7 and the aftermath of war and violence after that definitely occurred to us as something we needed to, as a museum, hold ourselves accountable for thinking about as well. A lot of museums, I feel like, even now, are still trying to figure out their footing in this conversation, which I think is really important for us to do. But I kind of, we ended up reconvening the group. We wondered whether or not we should, because obviously all of these people were emotionally affected, and we were, by, but to a greater degree, by the things that had been happening. And we didn't want to put more emotional labor, ask more emotional labor of people who are already giving a lot and probably trying to figure out how to kind of keep their energy as it is. But we did reach out to them and just asked, is this something that would help you? Is this something that would be a positive thing for you? And if it's not, then we understand. But to a person, all of them felt like they really wanted a space to have this conversation, and the museum could provide that, which was ultimately kind of what we always hoped we could be as a museum. And there are also conversations about what responsibilities museums have as well. But I kind of wanted to kind of toss it to both Sarah and Kate. What did you notice or pick up on after the events in October and since then that we feel like are maybe things we might want to share with people who are thinking about doing this work or already doing this work?
I'll say two things quickly, Kate, and open up some space for you as well. I think I was very happy to get the email from both of you around, should we be doing something, right? Like, should we open this up again? Should we bring the group back together again? I think one of the challenges of doing community-based work and facilitation work within museums in this moment is that we all think of it as doing it beforehand, right? And then we think of it in terms of one exhibition or one program and one group. And I both appreciated and valued the museum's commitment and ongoing commitment to saying this is an ongoing relationship and we are committed to maintaining this relationship even in the hardest of times. And I think that that's something to take from your work on this, is that this isn't a checkbox, right? This is an ongoing shift in the way that the museum is operating moving forward. One of the things that I will say is that we very much knew that we were having this conversation relatively quickly after the October events. As we said at the beginning, I'm about to go in March for larger conversations in DC, but that's March, right? And though the situation is continually changing and is consistently volatile, we were talking in the very immediacy in many ways. What that means for you as organizations or for facilitators is that what we know is that in the wake of traumatic incidents, we are going to see an increase in terms of people needing spaces to approach a topic personally rather than structurally, right? So we knew that coming into this space, we were going to have to allocate more time for people to really just speak, to speak freely, to not feel limited in terms of time and how much space we were giving each of the participants to speak. That what was most important in that gathering was the container, Troy, that you spoke of, right? Just having a place to have the conversation and the comfort that everyone needed to be reminded of, which was this group of people trusts each other to a degree, and that we have a prior relationship with each other. And though these conversations are hard everywhere right now, we are coming to this space in a commitment that we continue to have them. So I think that was a bit of a shift in the way the room felt as we were gathering.
I think one of the big things that I took away from that time, actually from the entire experience, was, Troy, you talked about adding value to the lives of our participants, that they did want to come back together. They wanted to have that space. And we certainly had the sense that that gave value to them to be able to come into this place with people, as Sarah, who trusted each other. And honestly, I felt I needed it too.
Me
right?
too.
We all, Troy, I won't speak for Troy, but I'll speak for Troy because Troy and I have had a lot of sleepless nights and heartfelt conversations throughout this entire process. And it's been such a personally enriching journey for me, as well as a professionally enriching one. And to be able to just have time with these people who you have a lot of respect and value for, to share, to commiserate, to support, to offer advice, or just listen, was really healing. And I should also say that even before October, it wasn't like we said goodbye to them in April and then invited them back in October. Even that 6 months, we'd had multiple check-ins. Several of them came to the exhibition opening. Some of them brought groups through to tour, family members. Our educator brought a school group through. So, these were people who we'd continued to have been in contact with over that intervening 6 months. So that it did really feel natural to reach out to them at that point in time, that there was really a depth of authentic relationship building that had happened.
Yeah, it was a privileged place, I felt like, for myself to get a perspective on a region of the world that I was not taught growing up and in my educational spaces. And yeah, it was very humbling, I think, to realize exactly how much I did not know. And there are certain things that you cannot know until you are in relationship with people personally affected by everything. And so that was a real gift that our community gave to us. And we had intended all along to continue this relationship going forward with this group, and will. And in fact, a couple of them have already been involved in other community circles too. So that continues. Yeah, I even before October, there were things that were happening in tandem with our putting this exhibition together. For instance, the week before the opening, a Palestinian political activist had been detained. in an administrative detention, which means charges are not required to be stated, and your time in prison can be indefinite. And so, as a political action, he chose to go on a hunger strike, and it's very high profile, and he ended up dying the week of the exhibition opening. And one of our activists, one of our group who happens to be an activist, said, you know, I appreciate the work we're doing here, but I will be organizing a community rally to talk about this. And I think without even talking to other, Kate and I said, we totally understand. And, you know, we, weren't exactly sure about what our response should be, but we knew we should provide space for people to do that and encourage them to do that, because this is about community building and sharing information. Our role specifically was not informational. It was not, a speaking role in any way. But as a community member of Corning, I felt like I needed to be around and watching what was happening in my community. And there was some nervousness, I think, on the part of our museum about how this would happen, play out with the opening of the exhibition happening that same week. But in retrospect, it turned out to be a net positive thing, I think, because of the involvement we had with our community circle. And they had already and continued to value the work they were contributing to the museum and that space, could talk about what the real relationship was between the exhibition here and the events that were happening there. And we did not have to be the mouthpieces for that. That community group was empowered to do that and to kind of present it clearly and as with a much less biased view than would have come from the institution, so to speak.
Well, I think
don't know.
speaks
You want
to
to talk more about that, Kate?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think it speaks to the difference between, what the institution can do with an institutional voice, and especially, as a museum of glass, we're a museum that's dedicated to a material. And some stories, I think, aren't necessarily ours to tell. But how can we, be true to the mission of our organization and support and uplift the voices of others in these spaces? I'm sure Sarah has thoughts on this kind of role of the institution as well.
Maybe the most important thing I would say about this is we had a lot of conversations even prior to that activist's death, as well as just activism generally around these topics in the region. And one of the things that the three of us talked about is the thing about activists is that activists are not patient, right? That defines activism in many ways. But activists are also some of the most important allies that institutions can have in doing community engaged work, because they are the epitome of engagement. And so in order to do this work effectively, inviting activists into your space is just vitally important. Now, the challenge with that is that museums are inordinately patient, like super patient, super slow patient. And so those two values come into conflict with each other sometimes. And it was wonderful to have the process include people who define themselves as activists within the space. But it does mean that the museums who are involving those folks are going to benefit from a great wealth of knowledge, a great wealth of passion, a great wealth of energy and commitment to what the museum is doing, because that's how they move in the world. It also means that the museum needs to be on the same page about how they will continue to negotiate those spaces of individual and institutional activism, right, as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that was one of the big education points for me. I don't know, maybe for Kate too, is realizing that these people are not just defined by their connections to the objects, but they're, the community circle, or connection to the region from where they came from, they have multiple identities. Some may be activists, some may be religious leaders, some may be classroom teachers, and we had all of them in our group, and really sort of figuring out. This is the first time I can ever remember. I mean, I'm an activist in other spaces on other topics, but I'd never really thought about how my role might change from group to group, but it definitely does, you know. So I'm thinking about kind of questions, and we've got just a few more minutes, but I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of what surprises there were for you during this process. You know, I feel like for me, we've already talked about Qadr Adnan's death during that process, which I was really surprised by the trajectory of that journey, and actually how it helped me grow as a person, just as a person, not just even as a museum professional. But what things surprised you both?
Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Probably in no small part due to my personal, world and existence, and the museums and institutions that I've kind of grown up in my facilitation work. I was expecting a more contentious space than we had. And I want to put that forward to say that there are a lot of museums and folks who may be here with us today that fear doing some of this work because they are thinking in that worst case scenario of the contentiousness, right? And how will we handle disagreement, and how do we handle conflict? It's why facilitators enter this space, but I tell you that I was nervous about the contentious nature, or what I expected to be contentious, based only, right, from my own personal thoughts, opinions, right, and concepts moving into the space. That's a challenge for all of us as folks who work in museums and as facilitators, to not be predictive of what we think is going to happen. I came in thinking, and we had lots of measures in place about what I was going to do and how we were going to handle conflict as it arose. And then it simply wasn't there. And this group of folks engaged with such a high level of mutual respect for each other, the institution, and by that I mean both, you, Kate, and you, Troy, were able to sit in this space with very little conflict or defensiveness, which isn't always the case of having institutions in the room with individuals. And it truly was a lovely, seems like a challenging word at this moment, but it was a lovely space to be in. And part of that was who was there, part of that was how the museum handled it, part of was having a facilitator. But that was really surprising to me. It was a great surprise, but also made me think about and check where my blind spots as a facilitator can be coming into spaces like this as well.
Yeah, I'll add, I spoke briefly about this earlier, but like that was so personally enriching for me to go on this journey. I think there's a tendency, especially among curators, like you do get a little defensive. Like, I've been working on this for years, and I know what I want to focus on and why. And, you do feel very committed to it. But I think being open to those other ways of thinking about this material that are different from the frame that I bring really enriched in subtle and not so subtle ways the ultimate content of the exhibition, much more than, I don't know that I was thinking about it as box checking going into it necessarily, but a little bit more in sort of like, okay, let's go through this. I don't really know what's going to be coming out of it. Trying to trust the process, knowing that we had these kind of frames that we'd put in place, and trusting that process. But I'd never experienced it before, so I was really nervous and uncertain about what was going to come out. And then it was really generative, and made a better exhibition. I think helped the museum in many ways. So that was my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that we were so grateful and so happy that the group wanted to come back together and continue kind of the relationship and working together. And we asked them for, like, what are some ideas? We can't say we can do anything or everything. This timeline was very short. The exhibition closed in early January, but they came up with some really good practical and not impossible to implement changes. And I was feeling pretty happy about that and confident about that. And the way our museum works is we really needed to check in with leadership. And so our leadership representative went back to staff, and it was at that point where I think I realized, because we got some feedback that indicated that, and it shouldn't have been a surprise to me, as a staff of 200 people, that not everybody was on the same page. And, rather than be defensive about that or feel, kind of like that was a misstep or whatever, what we took away from that was our staff is a community too. And they deserve the same attention and care and compassion that we provide to our community circles. And so, we had not done some due diligence, just checking in with some people who on staff had these connections to this area. And I feel like that was something I hope to never let happen again, because if I really believe that museums can play a role in building community, it needs to play a role in building its internal community as well. So yeah, that was an important lesson for me.
Such a good point, Troy. And also, a challenging one as we all move forward in the work to think about as well, right, is how do you approach those members of your internal community to be a part of something without also burdening them with extra intellectual and emotional labor because of their connections to an exhibition or a topic or a region or ethnicity. So a really something that's very contingent on the way that those folks are approached, but with recognition that they need to be approached, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I think we'll let Sarah have the last word here, but don't turn off your computer yet, because Kate and I will be here for the space to field questions that may come from our real-time participants. So Sarah, thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure to have you in our space. Thank you, Kate. And we'll look forward to continue this conversation in real time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right. So thank you, everyone. That was a really great panel and really good background on the work we did with our communities here. We do have a few questions. One from our audience: what happens if the relationship between the museum and a community group becomes confrontational, not cooperative like this one? And I think Sarah was kind of getting to it, so I'm sad she's not here to answer that question with us, but if either of you would like to start and take that one.
Go ahead, Troy.
Yeah, Sarah is right that this group had a lot of trust and built a lot of even more trust over the time we were with them. But it would be a mistake to say that there were no disagreements and there was not any confrontation within the group. And led to some of those sleepless nights that Kate was talking about in her remarks and during the tape session. I guess I can tell you how we handled it in the moment, which was this is where a professional facilitator really did come in handy, because I know I was sitting there thinking, oh, okay, I wasn't trained for this yet. And thankfully, Sarah had been in this situation so many times that she was able to kind of keep the structure in such a way that certain group guidelines that we had kind of set up in advance, long before we dove into the topic of kind of mutual respect. I mean, all of those values that were articulated in that one slide of justice, truth-telling, non-erasure, all those things sort of carried into the conversations that we had with each other. So I feel like one thing I can recommend is getting a highly trained facilitator who is used to working with groups that are not always quite as not as uncontentious as ours might have been compared to others she's worked with. But I think from a staff point of view, it felt really important that I kind of keep my emotions in check. Not that I didn't want to not have them, but the space of those meetings was not the time and place for me to kind of flip out. You know, I can do that later. I need to be present for the conversation and the topic that we're having, and also realize it's not personally necessarily directed at me, even though someone may be doing that. It's coming from a place of, well, I love the way Sarah phrased it as, you know, there are structural points of view on events, and then there are personal points of view on events. And the personal is often so attached to emotions that we don't even often have a lot of control over that. And I recognize that for people who are attached to some of these issues where we would need to bring in a facilitator. So I try to have as much empathy as I can too. But I have to say, I think Sarah would be a great person to ask that. And she did offer, if we wanted to follow up with her with any questions, we could pose them to her. And so I feel like this is a good one that I would like to pass on to her as well. So, but before we move on though, Kate, what do you have thoughts?
Yeah, that was going to be my response is, I mean, obviously avoiding that confrontational situation on the first, you know, like, and having that facilitator who can be the sort of moderator and neutral party, and just uplifting, again, that kind of results oriented perspective, right? Coming into a space, there's going to be disagreement. I think we can kind of look back on it now with the way things, you know, have transpired and say, you know, this was a really positive experience for everybody involved in it. But it certainly, as you said, Troy, didn't feel that way all the time. And like there were tense moments all along the way. And we were fortunate in that even though people disagreed, they did so respectfully, and just kind of setting that tone, and yeah, focusing on, okay, what we can all listen to each other. First of all, we can understand that we're not going to agree. And there are only certain things that we can do, and really focusing on those outcomes.
The only other thing I would add also is that it was not always comfortable to be in this space. And I feel like that's something, if you are going to include more voices in the stories that you tell and in the way that you tell them, there are going to be uncomfortable moments when our blind spots as museums are revealed, and, you know, not being able to answer a question like which is posed is revealed, you know, but that has to become normal. It has to, in some ways, just become a part of your expectation, and it's okay. You know, it's okay to feel that way, and it doesn't mean you're a bad person, or, you know, whatever, that you're failing in some ways. You know, it's just part of the game.
Thank you both. Following up a little bit on that, Troy and Kate, how do you think this experience of the community circle process will inform future community circle work here at the museum?
I'll let you go
Kate,
first.
I think you've got some experiences already that have resulted from this experience.
Yeah, so Troy and I put together a second community circle for the museum on an installation that we worked on beads from West Africa, that we just opened in December, which is a permanent installation, not a temporary exhibition like Dig Deeper was. And we put together a community group and actually included a few of the folks who were involved in our Dig Deeper community circle. So I think and we both felt it was a little bit less contentious of a subject matter. So it was a little bit, it wasn't nearly as fraught. It wasn't nearly as high stakes, but it certainly made us feel much more comfortable working in this way and inviting people into the process and getting like really honestly fantastic feedback, as like almost this kind of test audience, who came in with their own ideas and like questions and perspectives of what they wanted to know. So, you know, I think we are planning to do more work in this way, more of this, as Troy said in the video, formative evaluation, to, you know, just make our exhibitions more relevant to our visitors, more meaningful, answer the questions that they have about content, that are going to be different from the frames that we bring as museum professional or even as class experts.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, if you have someone who is sort of charged with interpretive strategy. The issue of maintaining relationships when everyone is so busy and museums move from project to project to project, it's very easy to lose those connections. And so at the moment, Kate and I are working together on coming up with kind of a standard operating procedure for, what are the things you need to do first? What happens next, and then what, and how are you going to handle reciprocity, and how do you maintain these relationships? And we're not there yet, but I think once we get there, that will remove some of the guesswork about kind of how the process happens, and free up more mental energy for us to be engaged and present in the process as the more meaty conversations happen. But we're still working on our toolkit for that.
Yeah. And that's definitely the challenge as you work on different projects, is maintaining that level of authentic relationships as you continue to widen your circle, even within, a relatively small community like Corning and the surrounding area. I think that's something we're really trying to figure out, how to sustain all of the relationships we carry.
Yeah, we miss them. I mean, I miss the frequency with which we got together, and we still see each other in town, which is the nice thing about living in a small town, is that you will run into people. So
yeah, and one way to do that that we didn't talk is like show up in people's space, like at people's community events when there are public opportunities to go to different kinds of gatherings. Just showing up as an individual, right? Not even just as an institutional representative, to continue to sustain those things.
And I know that can be a heavy ask for people. I mean, museums, we're nonprofits, we're oftentimes under-resourced, and so there's not a lot of extra energy or time built into our schedules. But even if you have to consider that part of your work time, just not always expecting our community to come to us, but to be present in our other community spaces too, where we're invited. Obviously, we wouldn't want to go someplace where it was not a space for us. But that's just gone a long way, I think, towards educating me, for one thing, about things like events and traditions I know nothing about or knew nothing about. But it also, I think, gives you opportunity to connect and deepen relationships.
Thank you both. I think we are actually at time, but there was a question that came in to the chat here that maybe we could do a real quick response to. Do you ever feel the need to change an exhibit, parentheses, labeling, or the like after it opens based on a visitor response? So we have something that does, it's part of the permanent collection that Kate was talking about with the beads work. So I didn't know if we wanted to just quickly maybe address that before we wrap and get into the next session.
Yeah, sure. And we would, sometimes it's
and
not
have.
Yeah, and have, exactly. Sometimes it's not quite as timely as we might all like, but certainly if there are errors or misstatements, serious matters that are brought to our attention, we would look carefully at it and, go to the time and trouble and expense of replacing something that needed to be replaced, that we kind of collectively determined.
Yeah. All right. So thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Kate and Troy, for being here live to answer them. Thank you, Sarah in absentia, for participating in our session with us. And our next session is with Kate. She's going to take us through Dig Deeper. So I'm going to turn things over to Kate.
Thanks, Mika.
Thanks,
yeah,
Mika.
Thanks everyone. Oh, thanks, Troy. Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to transition us into the tour of Dig Deeper, which had we had the seminar in October, I would have done live for you and you would have gotten a nice live tour. But the exhibition closed about 2 months ago now, which I'm still sort of in mourning for. But before it closed, because we knew we wanted to do this, our amazing video team here filmed my tour instead. So we're going to watch that that film of the tour to give you a little bit more of a sense of the space and how many of these things kind of came out in the exhibition itself. And then I'll be sticking around. There'll probably be about maybe 5 minutes at the end before our break, if there are any questions, or I'll be watching chat too. So if you want to chat me a question along the way, I'll be happy to answer it. So without further ado, here is past Kate giving a tour of Dig Deeper.
Hi, I'm Kate Larson, and I'm the curator of ancient glass here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And I'm also the curator of the special exhibition, Dig Deeper, Discovering an Ancient Glass Workshop, which I'm really excited to share with you today. I like to think about Dig Deeper really as an homage to everything that the Corning Museum of Glass is and does. The Corning Museum was founded in 1951 as a gift of Corning Incorporated to the nation. And it was really founded on the principles of art, history, and science of glass altogether. My background is in archaeology. That's what I was before I started my work here at the Corning Museum as a curator. And archaeology, like the Corning Museum, is fundamentally really interdisciplinary, thinking about those twin pillars of art, history, and science together. So when I started thinking about what an exhibition could look like here at the museum, I was really attracted to those three things together. And I think you'll see that in the exhibition about how all three of those pieces come together. Another thing that's really exciting about this exhibition is that I was thinking about it, as I said, really as an homage to the museum. And it centers on the work that was done by a team from the Corning Museum of Glass and the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, back in the 1960s. At that point in time, very little was known about how glass was made in the ancient world. And the Corning, Missouri team set out intentionally to ask questions that are still asked by visitors in our galleries today about how glass was made, what glass was made from, what did the furnaces look like, what tools did the glassmakers use, how did they shape the glass, how did they get the furnaces hot enough? These are all really important questions that we really try to answer in this exhibit in a really intentional way, using the material from this archaeological site that the Corning, Missouri team excavated in the 1960s. So the name of the site is called Jalame, and it's located in what's now northern Israel, just outside of the modern city of Haifa, at the foot of the Carmel Mountain region. So here you see it on a map where it occurs today. So the Corning, Missouri team set out in 1963 on an archaeological survey of the area throughout the modern country of Israel. And they went there in part because they knew from many ancient texts that Israel, the Levant, sort of Southwest Asia, was really a really important area for glass production in antiquity. So they knew they were likely to find something there, even though there hadn't really been a glass workshop that had been excavated there before. There had been things found that pointed to the existence of a massive glass industry there. So they surveyed, they found several sites, many of which went on to be excavated in the subsequent 60 years, but they picked Jalame because it seemed the most promising, and it was also located near some of the areas that were mentioned by those texts as being the sources for sand, and we'll see that in a little bit. So in antiquity, Jalame is the modern name of the site. We don't know what it was called in the ancient world. In antiquity, it was located in what was sort of the waning Roman Empire. The site's dated to the second part of the 4th century CE, so between about 350 and 400 or thereabouts. And this was a period in which the Roman Empire had split into two parts, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire that was governed from the city of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey. So the people who lived at Jalame and made glass at Jalame, they weren't really ruled from Rome anymore. We don't really know how they would have identified themselves, if they would have called themselves Roman, but they're in this area that was in antiquity, this area that was called Palestine. So that's where we are located in sort of place and space. But as we go through and we talk more about the Jalame workshop, keep in mind that a lot of what we're talking about is really typical of the traditions of glassmaking throughout the first millennium CE. So I really think about the Jalame workshop as emblematic for what glassmaking was like for a long period of time, really broadly representing the Roman glassmaking tradition. in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the first main space of the exhibition we call the Dig Jalame, and it really focuses on the excavation itself. And many of the things I just talked to you about why they went to Jalame, why they dug there, and what did they find. So these are the kinds of things that they found in that initial survey. Just pieces of glass making, pieces of glass debris, and the ways that they recorded it. We're guided through this section by the lead archaeologist from the University of Missouri on the project, Dr. Gladys Davidson Weinberg, who is a glass specialist who worked closely with the Corning, Missouri team. You'll also note several sort of themes starting to pop up throughout this part of the exhibition. One thing we did that was really unique for this installation was to really think about our youth and family visitors. So thinking about all the different ages of people who might visit this space. And we really wanted to target a wide variety and really give something for everyone. So you'll notice throughout that we have a lot of hands-on opportunities. So here we're showcasing archaeological tools, things that are used by archaeologists to really bring this to life, alongside our amazing graphic illustrations that were created by UK illustrator John Swager, and come in large part from the accompanying comic book for the exhibition. We also have here our first of our digital installations. We have this digital game that allows visitors to pick up an access pass and go through the process of conducting an archaeological excavation, of finding a glass object and studying it in a variety of different ways as they move through the exhibition space. So these are all kind of features that we'll see recurring throughout the exhibition. This area is really about highlighting the site itself and how the archaeologists found it. So some of our lending partners for this exhibition were the Israel Antiquities Authority, which still holds a lot of the material from the site, as well as the University of Missouri, which also holds many of the materials that were found during the excavations in the 1960s. So here we're showing several of the coins that were found at the site, which were used in dating the glass workshop period. And I especially love this gold coin, which still shows really amazing detail. So all these coins are dated to the second part of the 3rd century CE, which is the main reason we know that the site, the archaeological site was dated, or the glass workshop was dated to that period as well. And that's been verified by other excavations in the area and the type of glass that was found at the site. People often ask how you can date glass, if you can carbon date it or do any other kind of analytical technique, and we can't. So we're really reliant on things like this about what's found with the glass to be able to date it. And right next to it, we have a case that showcases some of these other principles that really underlie a lot of archaeological method, really thinking about how we know what we know about ancient glass. So this is a display that was built by one of our amazing preparators here at the museum, Isaac Hawley. And it's showing how different layers of soil show different ages of the deposits. So these are all things that I picked up locally in Corning, and kind of it's a little schematic concept of how things would have been buried over the years. If you were to dig down in your backyard in Corning, you'd find the newer things at the top, things like the COVID mask, which is immediately emblematic of 2020 and that experience that happened during the pandemic, going all the way back through cassette tapes, and then finally like much older materials that aren't like what we find today. So this principle is called stratigraphy, and it really helps archaeologists understand the relative chronology of things. So if we find different objects in different associations with other materials and are able to connect those with known dates, like from coins, we build up this vocabulary of dating of different pieces of glass and other archaeological materials. So this is actually the only intact piece that was found at Jalame, and we're showing it here with the different recording methods, which are also really critical in archaeology. And we wrap up this area by continuing the story with the excavations that are ongoing in the area. In 2015, the Israel Antiquities Authority was excavating at the base of the hill. The Jalame workshop that was excavated in the 60s is at the top of the hill. The Israel Antiquities Authority was excavating down at the bottom, and they found this series of 4 tank furnaces. These are primary glass-making furnaces, and you can see there's 1, 2, a corridor here, and then 3, and just the corner of the 4th one. And this really verified that this area was really important for making glass in antiquity at this point in time. And that's what we're going to go talk about next. Welcome to the Archaeology Lab. Our guide through this area is Dr. Robert Brill, who was the chief scientist of the Corning Museum for his entire career, for over 50 years, until he retired about 10 years ago. So Dr. Brill really led the scientific part of the Jalame excavations. And he was really charged with understanding the chemical composition of ancient glass and answering some of those questions about the materials. So here we have showcased the actual stuff that glass at Jalame was made out of. Sand from the Belus River, which was located just really a stone's throw away from the Jalame site. And you can see this image that was taken in 1963 of what that Belus riverbed looked like. So this is a silica-rich sand, along with natron from Wadi Natrun, which is a location in Egypt that produces sodium, minerals, a kind of mineral sodium that is used to make glass. So Roman glass, the glass that was made at Jalame, is a typical soda-lime silicate mixture. And we have Roman authors like Pliny, who was writing in the 1st century CE, that says that glass was made from Belus River sand and natron, or a mineral sodium, from Wadi Natrun in Egypt. So Brill's studies of the glass from Jalame were actually the first to verify this experimentally. So Brill collected these materials and tested them and found that the compositions were consistent with the material that was found at Jalame, like these pieces here. And it was only later, much later, that we realized, in part due to those discoveries that the IAA made nearby, but that glass was also being made at Jalame in primary furnaces. So we talk about glass making in the ancient world as being divided into primary glass making, the sort of manufacture of glass from raw ingredients, like the natron salts and the Belus River sand. And then it's made in these like big tanks. So all those ingredients are mixed together in what we call primary furnaces. Here's another one of our great comic illustrations. And a large scale. So this is an even bigger one that we saw that the IAA found at the base of the Jalame Hill. Those are about 4 feet wide by 6 feet long. And they got bigger and bigger throughout antiquity. So those materials would have been mixed up and then fired in these furnaces for days or even weeks at a time to basically cook those materials together to form the glass. And then this entire superstructure was disassembled, was taken apart. So that's why one of the reasons we don't have really any of those that survive. We just have those foundations. And the glass, which would have been left behind in this big sort of slab, was then broken up into smaller pieces where it could then be shipped out or sold to glass workshops throughout the Mediterranean and the rest of the ancient world. So another question that people ask pretty regularly is how glass gets its color. So those basic ingredients that go into making glass, that sand and that mineral soda, create a lot of discoloration in the glass, like these blues and greens here. And that's actually we call that a naturally colored glass, and it's due to the iron that comes in, particularly with the sand, that reacts in the furnace and gives it these really beautiful blue hues, green hues, and then brown if it ends up if that burning environment is a reducing environment, meaning there's not a lot of free oxygen available. So these are all, if you tested each of these pieces, you'd basically find them to have similar compositions. There's not different colorants or anything in them. It's all due to the presence of the iron in the glass. So what do you do to get a colorless glass or to get a more deeply, richly colored glass? In that case, you add some more mineral oxides or metallic oxides to the glass. So things like copper, which will give you a really rich, darker blue. You can also add a cobalt oxide, or manganese. So manganese is one of the most popular colorants that was used in the Roman world. And in different sort of concentrations and through different permutations, manganese will either give you this sort of purplish color, or it will even decolorize your glass. So it'll give you a colorless glass that counteracts the effects of the iron. So those are some of the ways that the glassmakers at Jalomé and elsewhere in the first millennium CE colored their glasses. We also talk about weathering in this area. Weathering is what happens to the surface of the glass after it's been buried in soil or in a moist environment for centuries or thousands of years. It's a kind of, people often wonder about the iridescence or the discoloration, some of this kind of brown or creamy weathering that they might see on the surface of ancient glass. And it didn't look like that when it was originally made. That's all part of the decomposition of the glass itself. And if we were to remove it, we'd actually be destroying the glass. So we'd lose some of these really amazing surface details. So this is something, and people like much later, like Tiffany and company, will work really hard to emulate some of these surface effects, like the iridescence, that they really admired in these ancient glasses. But they weren't that way in antiquity. They were really just would have looked like fresh, clean glass, like what you would use today. And it's only due to the age and the chemical interaction of the glass with the salts and the water that it's buried in that gives it that look. This entire wall showcases fragments of glass vessels that were found in the Jalomé excavations, alongside intact pieces from our collection and that were found at nearby sites in Israel, on loan to us from the Israel Antiquities Authority. So this was really one of the things that I felt was the heart of the exhibition, to showcase the way that fragmentary material is really important to understanding the nature of what's being made at Jalomé, and helps us to really understand pieces in our museum collection that we don't necessarily always have a lot of information about. So by showcasing like these different little fragments, you can look really carefully and see that the foot and the rim of these beakers match really closely to a piece like this that's in our collection that we don't have a lot of information about. But if you go over to our permanent exhibition area, and you'll see that a piece like this would have a label that says made between 350 and 400 in ancient Palestine, you might wonder how we know that, when all we really have about that specific piece is that it came from a collector in New York City and entered the museum's collection in the 1960s. Well, the reason we're able to give a date and a location to where we think that piece would have been made and used is because we find similar materials from archaeological sites that show these forms. Even though they're fragmentary, they give us a lot of really important information. We were also able to create a replica wood burning furnace that our amazing hot glass team built in the summer of 2022 to start to help us understand how these pieces might have been made in antiquity. So the video at the center of this area shows the way that, different ways that these vessels might have been manufactured using the same kinds of tools and techniques that were available to the glassblowers at Jalomé. So now we're in the workshop area, and this section of the exhibition really talks about the glassblowing techniques that were used at Jalomé. So when Gladys Weinberg and the other archaeologists who excavated the site in the 60s, when they got there, they found all this kinds of material, like you see scattered in front of me, that were littered across the site. And they knew it was connected to glassmaking in some way, but they weren't exactly sure how it would have been used. They were used to finding fragments of vessels and other kinds of broken things that were utilitarian, that were being used by people, and knew that these were waste products, but didn't understand how to interpret them. Remember, they're the first ones who had ever really paid attention to excavating a glass workshop. And they weren't familiar with even basic things about glassblowing that we really kind of take for granted today about our state of knowledge. So Gladys Weinberg happened to meet up with Dominic Labino in Toledo in the late 1960s. Dominic Labino, as you probably are aware, was an early figure in the studio glass movement, and as part of the studio glass movement was really interested in thinking about ways to make glass on a smaller scale, so more like what would have been done in antiquity. At the same time, Gladys Weinberg and the archaeologists were trying to also figure out how glass would have been made in the ancient world. So when Weinberg showed some of the things that they were finding at Jalomé to Labino, he immediately knew what they were. He immediately recognized them from the kinds of byproducts that he was making in his own workshop. So he was immediately able to point out things like these large chunks here that look kind of like glass and kind of like not glass. And what those are is that they're actually part of the wall of the furnace where the glass has eaten into the side of whatever is trying to contain it. Hot glass is incredibly corrosive, and glass furnaces, even today, usually don't last more than 5 to 10 years or so. And that's about how long we think that the Jalame workshop operated, in part because the furnace might have failed, had the same problems that we have with modern furnaces, and it would have needed to be replaced. And all kinds of other evidence points to the fact that this workshop was only active for a relatively short period of time. And that pattern is consistent with glass workshops that we find throughout the rest of the region as well. And what we think is happening is that we have semi-itinerant glass workers who are moving essentially from site to site, building new furnaces, probably locating different fuel sources. That's something we don't talk about in this exhibition, but we talk about in our Get Stoked exhibition, which is a partner to this one, about how important fuel use is in
I believe we're having some technical difficulties with the video. Stand by while we're working on bringing it up momentarily. In the meantime, I'm sure the team will flag me when it's ready. If there's any questions or other responses, thoughts. It's funny kind of watching myself give this tour back in December and thinking about all the things that we've talked about. Those of you who've been with us for the last day and a half consistently, thinking about like those manganese colorants and that kind of imperfectly mixed mixture that Gree and Ian talked about yesterday. Or even right now when I'm talking about the fuel sources, which Yael spoke about in her keynote yesterday. Yeah, I think it's, I feel like I've learned from all our speakers, and I would have done this tour a little bit differently in light of many of the things that I've learned from them over the last day and a half. So thanks for your patience with us as we're working on bringing that video back up. Yeah, it seems to have cut out at the end. My team is telling us that that might be all we have. So I apologize for that. But yeah, if there's any other questions or observations. Okay, question. Thank you, Janet. Do you know how big the cullet or chunks would have been that they shipped from the furnace? Well, we do have some shipwreck sites that Yael mentioned yesterday that do have some of those chunks, and they're mostly pretty small, kind of fist-sized or maybe a little bit bigger, not very large. I think the biggest chunk of cullet I've seen of raw glass from antiquity in maybe one of these kind of transshipment areas was actually from Tarha, which is a site that Kathleen Slane mentioned yesterday, where it's not like maybe a foot, 2 feet long and yay big. I mean, still not massive. You may have noticed in some of the photos we've been showing at the exhibition, there's a massive piece of glass that weighs 1,000 pounds that was at the center of the exhibition, kind of was our grounding point in the middle, which is not actually an ancient piece of glass. And in fact, the label for it was, why is this big piece of glass here? And we're really clear that it wasn't ancient, but we wanted something that would kind of ground the space and be really a strong visual attractor and give us a little bit of a sense of scale because so much of the other material was so small. So probably, yeah, they would have been fairly small pieces that were sent for use in other glass workshops. Oh, and yeah, I was saying for up to 15 kilograms. Thank you. Thanks, Yael. And how they might have smashed up the big slabs. Some of it would have just happened sort of as the glass was cooling, that it was cooled, as Yael mentioned yesterday, it was cooled fairly quickly. And so, you know, that annealing process of glass, it would have just fractured automatically. So that would have caused some of the breakage. And then you could have just used a hammer, chisel, basic equipment to break it up into some smaller pieces. There's another question that I'm not sure I entirely understand. Are the Corning pieces on display? I'm assuming you mean the pieces that have been in Corning that came from the site. So not now, since we closed the exhibition, that's all off view. One day we were able to retain some of the pieces from Jalame here in Corning on long-term loan. And I would love at some point in time, maybe in the next year or so, to put a more permanent installation of the Jalame material and tell that story in our permanent galleries in a little bit more fixed way. But right now we're sort of like in recovery mode from the temporary exhibition. So yeah, at some point in time. All right. So I'll do a little bit of a verbal narration for the part we didn't get to in the rest of the workshop. So one of them, what I was probably about to talk about in the tour, and I'm sorry you don't get to see it, is our display case that featured many of the small fragments of the glassblowing waste that were found at the site, and how we had videos that documented them from the wood-fired furnace, which you'll see actually in a half an hour or so. We've got our hot glass team coming on. And looking really carefully at a lot of those fragments to learn what we could about ancient glassblowing. And I would always point out on my tours, in the moils, there's often a little bit of a dark spot, which we know from chemical studies and other reasons is actually a little bit of iron scale that's flaked off onto the glass. And so when we say we know that their blowpipes were made of iron, even though, as we discussed yesterday, blowpipes tend not to survive in the archaeological record because they get remelted. Glassblowers take them from place to place. As Alicia mentioned this morning, like they're sort of making the Syrian glassblower who was making do with whatever he kind of could find around to make his own tools. But that's how we know that the primary material they were using to make their blowpipes was iron, because of those like little bits of iron scale that are present in the moils. I also went through and I measured a lot of the moils from Jalame. We have easily over 1,000 that were here in Corning, and I kind of documented a little over 500 of them kind of at random. And it seems that there's 2, maybe 3 diameters of blowpipe they were using. One that's in sort of, and they're really pretty small compared to what a modern glassblower would use. One that was sort of in the range of 1 to 1.5 centimeters, and one that was around kind of 1.8 to 2 centimeters or so. That seemed to be that blowpipe diameter that they were using. So by looking really carefully at these little fragmentary bits, we can really kind of start learn some real concrete things about the activities of those glass makers. And then the final zone that I would have wrapped up in is that marketplace zone, which included Dima Surji's work, as well as the burial material from Khorfash, and talked in general about the sort of distribution of glass in antiquity and today. But again, those of you who've been along on this journey with us for the last day and a half will have kind of gotten a little bit of a sense of that already, and some of the use of some of these containers and so on, or the material made at Jalame. And I think it's been, I don't know that anybody's really said it specifically. So the Jalame workshop is primary workshop making raw glass, secondary workshop making glass vessels. We know through the blowing debris, and that raw glass is going out, widely through the Mediterranean, North Africa, into northern parts of Europe, and perhaps even Britain. But the vessels they're blowing at the site are much more limited in their distribution for really a regional market. So they're really supplying a more local clientele, a local customer. And these materials are mostly like they're basic blown vessels, they're utilitarian shapes, with the exception of those very few examples we have, mostly on the raw material waste of purple or like that little tiny bit of colorless that we were talking about yesterday with Ian and Gree. They're mostly making natural colored glasses, so it's not an extra added expense. It's that sort of lower quality Judean glass and fairly basic forms. So really intended for kind of middle class levels of consumption. And dining service, table services, and then many oftentimes they end up in burial assemblages. So it appears that, again, I apologize that our video of the tour did cut off and I can't show you the rest of the space, but if there's any other questions, feel free to, yeah, place them in the Q&A. Otherwise, well, it's been a long bit of time and I want to give everybody a little bit of a break. But do be back here, can kind of just mute us, stay in the room. And we'll be back at the top of the hour at 3 o'clock Eastern time to hear from our hot glass team who built that wood furnace and kind of got to dive into their own kind of experimental archaeology themselves. They're going to be talking about that process in more detail and what they learned from it from the perspective of being glass blowers. So with that, I will leave you. You'll see me again later. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you at 3.
All right, I think I'm live here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Meek. I'm the Senior Manager of Hot Glass Programs here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And we're here to talk to you today about some really amazing work that happened in the past couple of years leading up to the Dig Deeper exhibit. And that is the creation and use of a wood-fired furnace here at the Corning Museum of Glass. I wanted to start this off, of course, by thanking Kate Larson. I was looking through my emails, getting ready for this presentation, and the first email I have from Kate talking about this project was in 2018. And I know our conversation started even before then. So I just wanted to recognize Kate's efforts and the incredible institution that we're all fortunate enough to work at that supports ideas like this and hands-on learning like this. Before we introduce the panel and before we start to talk about the wood-fired furnace, I thought it would be wonderful to share some of the other work of our talented colleagues here. And that is a really lovely video that we've posted on YouTube and that we've used, which highlights just some of the really beautiful ambient scenes of the wood-fired furnace. So before we kick off on our panel discussion and our presentation here, I just wanted to share this video with you all. All right. Yeah, sorry, no sound. I guess that's the enticement to check out our YouTube page, where that video is available with sound and a lot of other pieces that were put together by our amazing digital team here. So at this time, I think the rest of the panelists here are able to join me. I know Catherine was having, oh, there's Catherine too. Excellent. So again, my name is Eric Meek, and I'm really proud to introduce the team who worked on this. So these the folks here are all part of the Hot Glass Programs team, including Jeff Mack, who is our manager of Hot Glass Programs, Jesse Rassid, who leads our technical team, and one of our master craftspeople, Catherine, who is a gaffer here at the Corning Museum of Glass, a full-time glassmaker. So everyone, thank you guys for joining me today. It's good to see y'all.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
You too.
All right. So what we wanted to do in this presentation is just to talk a little bit about our discoveries along the way of creating this furnace. And let me see if I have control of the deck here. There they are. Okay. So making glass out of a wood-fired furnace, I think, is a dream of every glassmaker's. And the other thing I'll say, just to start off this conversation, is that the four of us are all glassmakers, right? And so making glass out of a wood-fired furnace, I think, is something that all of us dream of, especially being around all of the objects here at the Corning Museum of Glass. So we have glass objects which span thousands of years of history, and you know that a large number of those pieces were made in a furnace which primary fuel source was wood. Of course, you know, as contemporary glassmakers, you don't really have that opportunity. But here at the Corning Museum of Glass, we've been curious about this. Of course, the guests here at the museum ask us about it all the time. And so starting over 15 years ago, we were utilizing the resources of a local community college, the Corning Community College, which has a great ceramics program. And we actually just wanted to see what would happen if we melted glass in one of their wood-fired kilns. So these are ceramic kilns. And so here you can see some images of us working at those furnaces quite a few years ago, just to do it, you know, just to see what it was like, see how it was different from working out of a gas furnace. The other thing I'll say, just as a primer to this conversation, is that we have to make sure we give our thanks to Mark Taylor and David Hill, who are really pioneers in this field. And I'm sure they've been discussed in this seminar already, but Mark and David really have been the leading practitioners and the folks who have led the way in the research of replicating not only objects made in ancient times, but also trying to figure out how they were made in the most practical way possible, which is by recreating the circumstances. So we worked closely, especially Jesse, worked very, very closely with Mark and David, and they provided a wealth of information for us to start from. So I think, you know, knowing that Mark and David have done this, there was a discussion even in our museum, well, why should we do it? Why should we also do it? And fortunately, Kate and Carol and the institution quickly supported us in doing it here too, not because we wanted to do it different or better, but just because we wanted to do it too, and we wanted to do the process from the beginning all the way through to the end, just to see what information we could glean and what we could learn, primarily what we could learn about the conditions that glassmakers worked in ancient times. And that's something that I felt strongly that by doing it ourselves, we would learn more than by talking to Mark and David or observing them. And of course, that came to be true. Mark and David have done wonderful work. They've done a number of generations of these wood-fired kilns, wood-fired furnaces. And as I said, they were incredibly, incredibly generous in sharing their knowledge to help us be successful. The crafting of the furnace, the making of the furnace, this was primarily Jesse's task. So Jesse, I remember talking in your job interview, coming to the museum here about this project. And so Jesse started with us in 2022, right?
Yep.
Yep. And This was the very, very first project that you started on. So Jesse, we're going to walk through in these first couple of slides the process of making that first wood-fired furnace. So just tell us about what's happening in this slide here.
So yeah, in this slide, we're shredding the straw. So right when I first started working here at the museum, immediately I got into contact with Mark and David, and they very generously shared their recipe for daub. Daub is a mixture of clay and straw, and so they gave us their recipe and told us how they went about making it. And so our first thing was to procure some straw, and here you can see we're using this B40 straw blower, which was quite the overkill to shred up 3 bales of hay. And so this was our first step. We had to get all this straw shredded up, and then we had to get our clay. And so we linked up with Alfred University's ceramics department, and we got some refired clay. And this came to us dry, so we had to rehydrate it by weight. And so we weighed out all of our clay, and then we added we basically doubled the amount of water that we needed, because we had to make this clay absorb all this water and then some extra, because to mix in the straw, you had to actually make your clay even thinner than it's supposed to be. And then next slide. You can see we've on the left, we mixed all of our straw in. So this was a pretty big task, and it was very, very messy, much messier than I expected it to be. And the clay was very wet at this point. So for the first 3 days, we pulled this daub out, and we spread it actually on the floor in our workshop, and let a lot of the water seep out of it. And then once the water came out a bit, we packed it into 5-gallon buckets. And on the bucket on the right, you can see there's a hole punched down through the center of all of that daub. And that was something that I figured out really early on, was that the one of the biggest factors in being able to build the furnace was moisture control with the daub. And so we couldn't have it get too dry, we couldn't have it get too wet. And so we sort of had this whole Goldilocks thing going on, where we needed to get a lot of the water out of the clay. And so I found that by pushing my arm down through the center of the bucket, I could get water to seep out into the center section there, and then I could pour it off every morning. So we had about 900 pounds of this clay in buckets. And so from there, we designed our own furnace. And so we based it off of Mark and David's work, but we also we wanted to come up with our own design. And so that's me drawing this up. And from there,
Jesse, I do think, it's important to recognize too that, Mark and David had made these furnaces, but obviously at Villa Borg and places around mostly Europe, a lot of people have been experimenting with different designs. And when we were approaching the design of this, there were some practical things that we had in mind that would make it particularly well suited for our goals, which were to recreate objects and then also to capture some of the footage. So there were some design decisions for the furnace that were based on our specific needs, I believe, too.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the great things about building with daub, I think one of the things I came to think of as we were going through this process is that daub must have been like the 2x4 of the ancient world, right? Probably there was a daub guy in every town, and it was a known material that a lot of people could work with. And I think that might be one of the things that helped spread glass around the ancient world. The fact that these furnaces were relatively easy to make, I think.
Yeah,
I mean, we had a lot to learn, but I think relatively easy to make.
So so here we've started construction, and so the learning curve on this was really steep. We were sort of figuring it out as we went. We had notes and we had some information, but really, and sort of the root of the whole project is that you don't really know until you try something. And so we were flying blind and building this. And you can see, I figured out really quickly that I could only build a certain amount a day, because if I tried to get greedy and build too much furnace, the moisture in the daub would not support its own weight. And so it would start slumping, and it would sort of fall out on itself or slump down and thicken back up against the ground. And so you can see we started building, and it basically was built like a coil pot. We started at the bottom and worked our way up, and we would cover it because we didn't want the whole thing to dry until we were done with construction. And you can see we made some foam inserts to hold the negative spaces, our future doorways, and pipe warmers and stoke tunnels.
And this is all happening in the middle of winter here in Corning. So this is in February. And I think one of the clever things that Jesse did was to build this whole thing on a pallet, so that then we could take it into place when we were going to fire it. So
yeah,
it was definitely not built on site.
Yeah, we built this on a pallet and then on a layer of high temperature bricks, so that we could just roll it into place and be able to fire it up.
Right, and there were a couple instances where we, again, we weren't going for a replica of a Roman furnace. We wanted to replicate the sort of scale and the approachability and the fuel usage and things like that. But we used some other modern materials too. Can you talk about those three little holes in the side of the furnace there?
Sure thing. So those keyed holes down below the large openings on the side of the furnace, traditionally what they probably used were metal rods to as a shelf to hold the crucibles inside the furnace. Just by happenstance, when we were up at the local community college ceramics department, they had a bunch of these silicon carbide bars, and they were just something that somebody had grabbed, and there was an abundance of them up there. And so we asked if we could have a dozen of them, and they turned out to be just perfect. They were the perfect bar. They had a nice flat side to them. They were good to high temperatures and wouldn't slump, unlike metal. And so we immediately changed the design to take these keyway openings, and we were able to slide our silicon carbide shelf supports across in there.
Right,
So
and just to add a little more detail to that, I mean, you can kind of see it in the image on the left there, and that's where the pots of glass would sit, and below that would be the coal bed and the fire. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that one of our technicians, Tom Ryder, actually slip cast our own pots to use. So the little crucibles that held the molten glass were slip cast porcelain, which worked tremendously well too.
yeah, those worked spectacular.
Okay, so here's the image of us kindling our newly made, beautifully crafted furnace. Just starting a little fire in it. So once we got to the point of building a fire in this, Jesse, what can you tell me about, what did you expect in terms of heat up? How long did it take to heat up and things like that?
So this is our very first firing, and so you can see it's just a very small amount of wood. We had to figure out how this operated, this furnace. We didn't know, and so I suspected, because it was such a big heavy thing, that it would take a really long time to come up to temperature. And so we tried to baby it up and come up slowly. But what we discovered was that we put a little too much wood in the very first time, and it shot right up to almost 1,000 degrees in the first hour and a half. And we discovered that it did that every time. It just it would come right up. It was incredibly efficient, surprisingly efficient. It was unexpected, to say.
And that made us a little nervous, right? Because we know that, if the dog was still somewhat, it still had some moisture in it, that rapid temperature change could cause cracks, which inevitably happened anyway, but we always did want to try to control that ramp up to maintain the structure of the furnace as long as we could.
It was scary. It certainly was scary.
So Jeff, turning to programming, can you tell us about the work that the hot glass team was doing as this furnace was being built to prepare, to be part of the Dig Deeper exhibit?
Yep. So what we had to do was prepare to work at a different scale, prepare to work in a different style. Jesse was busy building the furnace and the glass blowers who were going to be participating, because one of the main goals was to capture some footage of us making glass for the Dig Deeper exhibition to help support that. So we wanted to learn about this stuff. So we actually, Bill Gudenrath generously gave of his time and demonstrated a lot of the techniques that they used for folding feet and making folds in glass, and just typical ancient glass blowing techniques. And we were practicing these in the amphitheater at the regular furnace. And we even did setups where we could try it on a chair, rolling it on our laps and things like that. It was very clumsy. And we had a lot of discoveries to make before we even really started playing around with this furnace. So Catherine Ayers, Chris Rochelle, myself, and some of the other team really practice some of the forms of the glass that would have typically been made at Jalame, or that's theoretically made at Jalame. Apparently, there's very little intact glass that was found at Jalame because it was a factory. So everything they were making, was shipped off. And most of what was left on the site at the factory would be shards and scraps and things like that. So in the region, there's a lot of different pieces that would have emulated the style of work that would have been made at Jalame based on some of the shards found there. And those were some of the shapes and forms and techniques that we were practicing before we even got to play with the wood fire furnace.
So what you can see here actually is that we've taken, and as Jeff was saying, we were practicing these forms in our studio here at the Corning Museum of Glass, which we call the amphitheater, and we've taken our bench and our tools out to this ancient furnace, and that's, I think, what's well represented in this image, and that is that we're taking what we know about glassmaking and how we do it today, and we're sort of imposing it upon this ancient furnace. So Catherine, can you just talk about the experience of working at this ancient furnace on this bench and approaching it the way that you approach glass as a modern glassmaker?
So when we first started practicing working out of the wood-fired furnace, we had the bench, as you can see in the picture, and it's completely different than what we're working with in our modern day shop. In the modern day shop, you're walking to the furnace, walking back to the bench, and there's a lot of movement, a lot of getting up and getting down. And so with this wood-fired furnace, it's a much smaller scale, and you're sitting right in front of the furnace. They typically worked right in front of the furnace, and everything was in arm's reach. And so we had to experiment with different size pipes, shorter pipes, because we were, sitting and then flipping the pipe around and then reaching into the furnace to gather the glass. And so there was a lot of working and then trying to think of, well, how would they have done this? And they might have needed maybe a shorter pipe, or everything needed to be very close, tight.
And as Jeff was saying, when we tried to work in what we thought would have been the style of ancient glassmakers in our contemporary shop, it was clumsy. Working at a chair, rolling on your legs, sitting right in front of the furnace. In our modern shop, that was horribly clumsy and awkward. But then this is an image of Catherine working at the furnace, and she's rolling the pipe on her leg, and she's situated very, very close in proximity to the furnace. And so, Catherine, tell us what shifted. So tell me how that felt different working at this ancient furnace.
The height of the furnace. So in our modern day furnace, it's waist high and you're much higher. So this beautiful little furnace that Jesse built was much lower to the ground, and it made sense to sit right in front of it. And you could actually, from where you were sitting, you could see down into the furnace, see the pot, see the glass. And so it just made sense to get rid of that bench like they would
And-
have done and work in your lap.
And it all kind of made sense, right? And I think that was one of the wonderful things that we had and our whole team was able to experience, is that this way of working that was awkward in the modern shop just felt natural, and it made sense when we were working at this little furnace. There's a question that came in, and it was asking about, was it uncomfortably hot working near the furnace? Did we have to worry about smoke and things like that? And I can see Catherine shaking her head no. And the only thing I'll say is something that I shared with a lot of people, and that this little furnace was friendly. You know, our modern gas furnaces, you know, they're aggressive and they're intimidating. But this little furnace with those, you know, the beautiful wafts of flame coming off of it, it was kind of friendly, and it wasn't intimidating or uncomfortable to sit in this proximity. At least that was my experience, Catherine.
Yeah, it was actually very peaceful. It was, you hear the crack, instead of the blowers from the big furnace, you hear crackling of the fire. You could feel the breeze, and there was some smoke, just like a bonfire, but not terrible. And it was very peaceful.
It
depended
was
which way
nicer
you
than
went
sitting
to.
in front of an open fire roasting your hot dog, right? Because you know, at least you have this containment of that heat.
Right.
And that was one of the cool things, is that we witnessed when we were doing this little campfire here, and just like any other campfire, this drew interest. So there are office buildings that are surrounding this lot where we were working, and even colleagues from the museum, they just came out of the woodwork to check out what we were doing and to gather around this you know, this lovely little furnace and this unique thing that was happening at the museum. And that really sort of informed where we went from here. I have a few more images to share of us working out of this furnace. Another unique attribute of this furnace is that you're reheating directly over your pot of glass. So you can kind of see it here, but just underneath, just inside of that opening, there's the pot of glass, the crucible of glass that you gather out of. And that is also unusual in a modern day furnace setup, where you can gather and work, and that facilitated this sort of solo work where you can gather with one hand, apply a bit or a handle while you're keeping the piece hot in the other hand. So it all just kind of made sense, and that was one of the great discoveries about doing this, of things that made sense. So Jeff, I know you mentioned earlier on that one of the goals of this project was to make sense of the Jalame site. So can you talk about other ways that working out of this furnace sort of informed some of the shards and bits and scraps and things that Kate showed us from the Jalame site?
Most certainly. Again, we had a lot of time to practice, and one part of our sort of discovery process before we even got to working with the furnace was meeting with Kate and looking at shards from Jalame, looking at pieces that had the folds in them, little feet that are broken off of things. We also got to see some complete objects, as well as a lot of the scraps from the site, from the factory site. So from the workstations and the dump bins and the things like that. So there's a lot of little tadpole looking things, and there's like these crazy double folds. So once we started working with the furnace, we noticed that we were making a lot of the same looking shards as what we were handling and looking at early on in the process, when we were looking at actually the ancient shards of glass from Jalame. And so, there was like a couple moments where, we played around with a fold and we made a double fold. And, Kate recognized that as, hey, that's an interesting technique that we see in some of these ancient pieces and shards. And it's really, so we were discovering things as we were working with this furnace, right almost from the get-go. Kate noticed us pulling little pieces of carbon out of the glass, because since it's wood fired, pieces of carbon and ash land on the surface of the glass, or there's pieces of the daub, because it's a more brittle refractory than what we use nowadays. It would fall into the crucible, and we'd gather it up, and there'd be little chunks that the first thing we would do, we would pull little pieces out of the glass and cast them off. And this was making these tadpoles that looked exactly like what was coming out of the Jalame workshop, 2000 years ago. So
And
that was kind of an exciting development to to actually be discovering things, even though other people have done this, to have cool realizations and aha moments, with the archaeologist who's in charge of it. And that was a lot of fun.
And again, this was really the goal, and what you see in this slide here is that we wanted to capture it, and we wanted to share it with all of the guests and visitors who saw the Dig Deeper exhibit. So here is Brad and Alexis, our amazing digital team, videographers, movie makers, capturing some of the things that were happening. We did this in 2 campaigns. We had a proof of concept where we fired the furnace in June of 2022, and then in September, so that fall, we had the session where we actually filmed what was happening. And so we had that time to test the furnace and to make sure everything was working right. You can see even Kate got in on the action and was able to work out of this great little furnace a little bit too. So, and that this all led to this amazing opportunity to share footage of what we experienced and what we learned for the guests of the Dig Deeper show. I had to share this. This is a picture, and I'm blowing glass in the background there, so near and dear to my heart. There was a question that came in, and Jesse, this is probably a good one for you. How much glass could we melt in a day, and about how many objects would that equate to? And just remember that we didn't make this as a capacity furnace, but just with what we had, how much could we make a day?
So with the crucibles that Tom Ryder made, each one of those held about 22 pounds of glass. And so we would have 2 of those side by side. We would have one with some sort of a copper blue type glass. And then the other one had a iron green with some black iron oxide in it. And so we had 2 different pots in there, and it was 22 pounds each. As far as how many pieces we made, I don't know.
We could work a day. Everybody, I mean, for the campaign, it took a couple hours to heat the furnace up, and then we would work for a couple of hours. So we'd usually wind up working from maybe 11 until 4 o'clock. And there was plenty of glass. By the time we were done, we were getting through it. But we easily could have made a larger capacity pot, I think. And the other thing is that the glass melted pretty quickly, and we weren't going for super high quality. So I think we could have topped up the furnaces too, if we had chosen to. Just very quickly, I wanted to touch on the sort of afterlife of our little wood-fired furnace. So we had a complimentary exhibit happening over the span of Dig Deeper, which talked about fuel use in glass making. Called Get Stoked. And so we put our furnace on display for the span of the Dig Deeper exhibit. And we talked about the use of fuel. We've calculated that we used about 1/3 of a cord of wood per day when we were working glass out of this furnace. So 3 days, a cord of wood is quite a lot for 3 days. But then we also have the opportunity here at the museum to run one of our electric furnaces on renewable energy. And so that's really an exciting development in glassmaking. I want to take the last part of our presentation to talk about the evolution of the project and the Gen 2 wood-fired furnace. So we only have about 5 more minutes to talk about this, Jesse, but I did want to say that, from our experience in working out of this furnace and seeing how intrigued people were by it, we then decided to do this as public programming for the summer of 2023. So we worked out of the wood-fired furnace once a week, every day over the summer. So that furnace had a little bit of a different design approach. So Jesse, we're going to shoot through these, but can you talk about the design approach for this Gen 2
Sure.
Wood-fired furnace?
So for the second generation of furnace, we couldn't hand build. We weren't able to use a daub type material. We had to use modern castable refractory so that it held up a little better to the multiple firings. We went up and down a dozen times, and the original furnace immediately was cracking and was very, very fragile by the end. So you can see our modern design has interlocking sides, which I had a eureka moment looking out in the yard one day and seeing one of my kids' plastic toys out there. And so we had to cast all of our different pieces. And so we had to make forms. And some of them were pretty complex. This is the face with the sills and the door cutaways. And then we use the same silicon carbide shelf supports. And here we are with some of the stoke tunnel is on the right up on the top, and various sides and fronts cast. And we did our first assemblage here, and we tested it, and it fit and it worked. It didn't fall in on itself, and it also wouldn't fall out and apart. And so here's what it looks like just bare. So this modern material was stronger, and it held up to the temperature better, but it was actually less insulative than the Daub. And so we wrapped it in fiber blanket and then used a mixture of plaster and sand to make a 3/4 to 1 inch thick shell over that, which actually lent itself to the appearance of it. And so here I am stoking.
Yeah, so, you know, it was just impractical to use a Daub furnace for programming weekly over the summer. And it was just a testament to Jesse's creative thinking and to be able to share this wonderful experience with our guests, but do it in a way that is sustainable and makes sense for us as the practitioners of the project. So Jesse, here, you know, is a good shot of you stoking the furnace and the wood. Just give us the highlights of what kind of wood we used, like what was stoking like tell us about the relationship between you in this picture, the stoker, and the person working glass.
So stoking turned out to be a lot more important than we initially imagined. The stoker was as important as the glass blower. And so we would stoke, we burned ash because locally we have the ash borer. And so there's a lot of abundance of ash, and it burned very hot, and it doesn't have to be fully seasoned to burn hot. And so you can see we have a lot of ash here in the picture. And so we developed a sort of funny rhythm with the glass blowers where the stoker would load up the furnace before the piece, give it about 5 minutes to burn out a little bit and not be so rich. And then the glass blower was sort of off to the races and would start blowing the piece. They'd take their first gather. And you can see there's an abundance of flame in these pictures. There's a lot of smoke. It was awesome.
So Catherine, this is kind of right after a stoke. So, you know, after Jesse's stoked, tell us what you could do and what you couldn't do as a glassmaker during this phase. And this phase lasted probably 30 seconds, and we were stoking about every 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, so once he started stoking, the smoke would, you know, the flames would be coming out of, there was a reduction flame, the flames were coming out of the front, and you'd pull your piece from the furnace and there would be a thin layer of carbon on it. When it had that thin layer of carbon on it, you couldn't stick handles, you couldn't stick your punty to the glass. You had to time it. You'd start the piece, and by the time you got to the punty, we'd punty, then stoke again. And so we had to develop this rhythm with the stoker, and I think it was every 15 minutes we were throwing in a few logs.
Yeah, every 12 to 14. And what would happen is we would have around peak temperatures of like 2050 Fahrenheit. And by the time you got to the point where you were about to punty, the temperature would be down in the 1800s. And so it would feel very cold, and you would feel a little bit frantic, like, oh, we got to hurry up and punty. And we would get that punty stuck on. And then as a stoker, we would throw smaller pieces, a whole bunch of smaller pieces. So we got a real bright flare up of heat and fire, but not a ton of reduction. We didn't want it to have too much smoke. And so we would throw a bunch of small pieces in and then hopefully finish the piece.
And I think a fun thing to sort of wrap the conversation up is hearing what each of your sort of primary learning was. So Jeff, from a glassmaking perspective, what's the one thing that stands out to you looking back on this project? You're just like, wow, I learned this. I didn't know it before I started this project.
I think it to me, it kind of reinforced the elegance of simplicity in how well the furnace worked. And it also reinforced for me the lesson of patience in glassmaking. and teamwork. You know, the stoker really did become a part of the team. So it was like a whole new, it was just a whole new way of making glass. But it, you know, and it to me, it just kind of connected me. For me personally, it was a real treat to do it. Not necessarily learning something about the glass, but just being able to kind of connect to my predecessors in this field and, you know, walk a mile in an ancient glassblower's shoes with a wood fire furnace, and, you know, see that you know, there were some exceptional challenges. You can see in our second version, you know, when we were doing public programming, you can see Chris on the left there. He's got a little miniature bench that Tom and Jesse built because it was kind of challenging to learn to blow glass on your rolling it back and forth on your lap. And you know, that, I mean, that is a real skill. Like, they had specialized skills that we no longer have as glass makers in making the glass this way. So that's kind of always an interesting discovery, is finding out, you know, that just because we're more modern, it doesn't necessarily mean we know more than ancient people did.
Well, and during our summer program too, we wanted to make sure that working on this bench was accessible to a broader range of our glassmaking team and even glassmakers in the community. And so it was a decision to bring back the bench rails. Catherine, how about you? Any lessons that really lingered with you?
I remember one of the first days when we went back to curatorial and we're looking at the pieces from the site, and there was that piece with the zigzag stripe, and it was, how did they do that? How did they get those points so sharp? And then, you know, working with Bill and practicing, you know, adding those bits yourself, it kind of just happened. I was thinking maybe they, you know, took a hook and dragged that sharp point up, but it was just the weight of the material and gathering it and bringing it yourself and doing
The
it.
dynamics of that special situation that we created here, that Jesse created. Jesse, any closing thoughts from you?
I loved the little furnace. I loved the whole project. It was just awesome. I loved it. It was so fun.
There's a question that came in about, you know, do we feel ancient glassmakers would have had to have developed that same rhythm with stoking and working? And yeah, I think absolutely. I think you know, you have a finite amount of time that you have that peak heat, that sweet spot, you know, and you know, our furnace is the temperature is like this, but the furnace, you know, the wood-fired furnace, the temperature went like this. And I think in ancient times, you know, that wave might have been longer and the peaks and valleys might have been lower because they optimized it, of course, but they still would have had to deal with that. So I definitely think that would have been part of it. I mean, we're almost at time. We have about 1 minute and 30 seconds. But Kate also mentioned there's nothing after us. So I did want to open it up if anybody wanted to share any other questions. We've got some great questions here coming in on the chat line. I don't know if people are able to speak or raise their hand or anything, but we'd certainly love to answer any questions if anybody has any others. But we certainly appreciate your engagement today, and it's a little humble to be here knowing that so many people have done this before and done it so well. So I don't want to present that we're pioneering anything here, but just the fact that we were able to experience it ourselves and do it here and contribute to the greater knowledge of glass. We're grateful for that opportunity. Excellent. So thanks everyone for your kind feedback, and Kate. As Kate appears, thank you again for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you all. It was such a privilege to work with all of you and see all of this kind of come to life. And I think it was a fun project. Like, we just had fun, and that's not something that you often get to say at work. So thank you all for being here and sharing your perspectives and experience on this. It was really great. So it is now my job to sadly and regretfully wrap up our seminar. It's been such a wonderful 2 days of discussions and presentations, and I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists, presenters, our session hosts and moderators for contributing their time and their expertise and sharing with us. As Carol White, our executive director, is very fond of saying, it takes a village to do these things. And so I especially want to thank all the technical support who's been with us all along behind the scenes. You haven't seen them, but they've been there solving all kinds of issues. So yes, thank you. Zoom hand claps to Scott Ignashevsky, Taylor Morse, Dan Paquette, Amy Hughes, Brady Spalding, and Emily Smith. Thank you for being here and doing all that you have done to make this such a great program and such a successful one. So recorded presentations, if you missed anything, will be available through the Zoom platform for the next couple weeks. And then we will be posting these publicly on YouTube within the next couple weeks as well. So please do distribute them and disseminate them to your colleagues if you found them useful. We do publish an open access proceedings of our annual seminar. The most recent available is from the 59th annual seminar on Sparkling Company, which is available under the museum publications section of the Corning Museum of Glass website. The 60th and now the 61st annual seminar will be in preparation. So tomorrow you'll receive a short survey from the museum. So please do take, just a couple of minutes to complete it so that we can continue to offer and improve our program. And finally, planning is already underway for the 62nd annual seminar on glass, which will be held this fall. And I can give you a little sneak preview. The topic will be glass and fragrance across time and place. So thank you again to everyone for being here. Have a great rest of your day and take care.